In the 2016 political battle over whether to take the UK out of the European Union, Brexit supporters dismissed professional economists' forecasts for significant economic damage if the divorce happened. But the results are now clear. The gloomsayers, as it were, got it right. And it bears lessons for other advocating broad disengagement from the global trading system. The Office for Budget Responsibility, charged with assessing UK Treasury policy, said its long-running prediction is broadly on track to show a 15% fall in trade. It highlighted that trade volumes haven't recovered from the pandemic by as much as other Group of 7 nations. And UK trade intensity, the export plus imports as a share of GDP, was 1.7% below pre-pandemic levels by the third quarter of 23, compared with 1.7% above pre-COVID levels in the rest of the G7. I talked about this week. The OBR's analysis also chimes with that of the Bank of England by showing that a long-term squeeze on the country's economic potential from Brexit is playing out as feared. There has been a 4% reduction in the UK economy's potential productivity compared with if it had stayed in the EU, as the OBR found. Brexit's impact can also be seen in the difference in sectoral performance in the UK economy. Goods trade was 10% down on 2019 levels at the end of last year, while its services trade growth has been the strongest in the G7. This is likely due to Brexit trade barriers being largely on goods, while the UK is less reliant on the EU for its services exports, as the OBR said. When it comes to trade barriers, that also likely to be a feature of the US presidential election campaign, now kicking into high gear. Former President Donald Trump has floated setting a 10% universal tariff and punishing traditional US allies and strategic foes alike in order to strengthen domestic manufacturing. As the debate unfolds, Brexit's pain may serve as a warning on the costs of separation. But how are the British getting along with the EU now? And this question is also of particular interest from a Swiss perspective. The United Kingdom, narrowly decided to leave the EU in a referendum vote in 2016, and the divorce was finalized in 2020, and a replacement agreement came into force at the beginning of 2021. That's the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. In addition to trade issues, this also regulates issues such as investments, competition, state aid, tax transparency, transport, energy, sustainability, fisheries, data protection, and social insurance. The EU Parliament has now taken stock. It approved a report from the relevant committees recently, and the report identifies a number of negative developments. Since 2016, the EU's trade with the United Kingdom has developed far less strongly than with other partners. The new agreement is the first EU trade agreement without any tariffs and import quotas, but it cannot be a complete replacement for full access to the internal market. A statement in the paper could be aimed at Switzerland as well as the UK. The United Kingdom is subject to all EU rules for third countries that do not adapt their law to developments in the EU. The EU's agreement with London does not contain any British obligation to automatically implement future EU legal changes. Therefore, is no longer full access to the EU internal market. Switzerland wants this full access, at least in certain areas, but to do this, it must fundamentally commit to adopting future changes to EU law. And the EU Parliament identifies significant non-tariff obstacles in trade with the British, including excessive bureaucracy. According to the paper, goods in sectors particularly badly affected by Brexit include vehicles, electrical machinery, wood products, agriculture and fishing. And the report also emphasizes that the British services sector, including the financial sector, will be hampered by the loss of automatic full access to the EU internal market. The analysis also finds significant losses in youth and student exchanges, and the number of new EU students in the UK has fallen by up to 50%. This is related to London's withdrawal from the Erasmus student exchange program. Tuition fees for EU students in the United Kingdom have risen massively in some cases. And there are also new problems for certain artists, as audiovisual services are not covered by the bilateral agreement. And Parliament is also disappointed with regard to foreign security and defense policy, as no agreement has yet been reached on deeper cooperation. The new obstacles have directly affected the lives of some citizens. That was, for example, said by Austrian EU parliamentarian Andreas Schieder. He's a social democrat and one of the two main authors of the report. For example, EU workers in London suddenly had to fulfill new documentation requirements despite having lived there for 15 years. Many EU workers, especially in low-wage areas of the service sector, have moved away, which has contributed to a labor shortage in Great Britain. Overall, reorganizing the relationship was more arduous than expected, but recently things have been moving towards normalization at least a bit. And according to Schieder, a certain economic pressure in the United Kingdom and geopolitical developments such as the war in Ukraine and the associated cooperation on sanctions and intelligence information probably helped. But the EU parliamentarian emphasizes that goods are still piling up at the border and are not getting through controls quickly enough. An important step was the political agreement on the Northern Ireland issue in February last year. What was sought was something like squaring the circle. On the one hand, there should be no new major border obstacles between Northern Ireland, which is still part of the United Kingdom, and Ireland, which is an EU member. But on the other hand, the EU wants to keep goods that do not meet its standards out of its territory. Now goods destined for end use in Northern Ireland will go through a simplified customs procedure, while goods destined for the EU market will undergo the usual checks. And this political agreement will be implemented gradually. But will this work in practice? I would think more likely yes, says Schieder. And the German Christian Democrat Daniel Caspary, who sits in the EU Parliament Committee for International Trade and Foreign Affairs, describes the Northern Ireland Agreement as fragile. According to Caspary, the overall relationship between Brussels and London has improved after a long, difficult phase, but he also lets skepticism shine through between the lines. The macroeconomic consequences of the Brexit decision for the United Kingdom are the subject of some economic analyses as well. Setbacks in trade and investment since the 2016 decision are often mentioned. In an analysis this summer, London economics professor Jonathan Portes estimated the overall economic loss to date at 2 to 3%. And last year, a study by the independent London think tank National Institute of Economic and Social Research came to the same size, which corresponds to a loss of £850 per resident per year. By 2035, this loss could rise to around £2,300 per inhabitant. Such estimates should not be taken lightly, but should only be viewed as a possible order of the magnitude, because Brexit is still not complete, and we still don't know the full extent of the damage that's to come. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.